All right, presentation number 9 here is Kinesiology 230. This is chapter 17, talking about sprint technique on page 466 of the book. So I'm dipping back into the book content from my own content in the last 2 presentations. With a lot of this, you'll recognize it from just my verbiage from talking through the last 2 presentations. In sprint technique, you talk about posture, leg action, arm action, acceleration. With program design, we're talking mode, intensity, recovery, volume, progression, and warm-up, all things you've seen before. So on 466 in the book, they talk about and provide a written overview of the many of the teaching points that I went over earlier. And it doesn't do it justice in terms of how complex it actually is. And as a coach, what you actually have to watch and how involved you have to be in the eye you have to have when you're coaching athletes regarding sprint technique, and then being able to translate that into a practice environment to a game environment to make it practical for what your athletes actually do. I mean, in some regard, I don't need my offensive lineman to be able to sprint 100 meters with proper running technique, but proper running technique allows me to better condition my offensive linemen because they can run more efficiently. So there's a constant trade-off that you have as a coach. You have to weigh those pros and cons when you're talking about sprint technique. And even the concept of using sprint technique as a low-grade plyometric activity for those offensive linemen has validity for what they're trying to accomplish as an athlete. All right, let's jump into these. We're just going to go right through these: mode, intensity, frequency, recovery, volume. So mode is determined by the speed characteristics that the drill is designed to improve. We talked a little bit about that before. Running, sprinting comes down to simple math of stride length and stride frequency. Stride length is how long those strides are. Stride frequency is how fast you turn them over. For either one of them, you're talking about overspeed or resisted sprinting drills. And with overspeed or resisted, you can kind of categorically just group them like this. You have overspeed where you're running on a slight downhill grade. It's not downhill, but it's on a slight downhill grade, enough where you can get good running mechanics and do so at a faster turnover pace. If we look at this is another example of overspeed where we have one person in front, the other person behind. You have a rubber band type of piece of equipment in between the two of them. They're wearing a belt. Person 1 takes off. Person 2 takes off a split second later after person 1 passes the third cone, whatever the cueing is. And person 1 is actually, through the course of the elastomer or the rubber band, is pulling person 2 along at a faster rate than they're accustomed to, requiring them to turn over faster. With resisted, running uphill is a great example. So these folks here, they could do downhill one day, uphill the next day if they want. Same thing here, but notice the slope on this. It's a little bit too steep to do downhill. They would end up slamming their toes in the front of the shoes as they're braking all the time, meaning trying to slow down. Doing resisted running with a parachute behind the person is also pretty darn common. You'll see that done a number of different places, whether it's elementary school, high school, college. But the idea is a drag chute slows the person down. And then last but not least, we have pulling a sled, same idea. Now the differences with pulling a sled and running a drag chute and also running uphill, pertain specifically to where the resistance is coming from. So with this, the resistance is coming from a low position to high, so it's going to have a different, slightly, not night and day, but a slightly different effect than a drag chute that is being pulled straight behind the person horizontal with the ground. A little different in terms of mechanics, a little different in terms of outcome, but the idea is when you look at these, you have overspeed, resisted, just different variations of each. And so when you look at this, assisted and resisted, they can improve performance, and assisted may be used in terms of stride frequency, whereas resisted sprints are more about stride length. When you think about what's happening there in terms of doing assisted, that's more like an overspeed type of drill where you're forcing yourself to turn over faster. And then the resisted, whether it's powering up a hill, dragging a chute behind you, or dragging a sled, those are for stride length because you're working on the power component, meaning how much force you're applying into the ground to be able to propel yourself forward with each stride. Intensity. I won't belabor you too much with this, but it could be form close to maximum speed for proper mechanics and stride length and stride frequency. The overall distance depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. You can quantify this any number of ways. You can do it by time or by distance. And the intensity, though, will almost always be, 90 to 100%. Now, I can tell you that I'll do hollow sprints with athletes where I want them to learn gearing, or I'll do specific gearing drills between cone 1, cone 2, cone 3, cone 4. I want them to accelerate, maintain, accelerate, maintain, accelerate, and then maintain that speed or accelerate into the finish. It just depends what I want to do with the athlete on that day. But the point is, you can do some things in terms of sprint mechanics and have your athletes learn how to have the ability or the skill to gear up or gear down as they're running. But once you look at this, training acceleration requires covering short distances. You can think about what happens in the first 20 meters of a sprint. It's all about acceleration, whereas maximal training velocity requires covering longer distance greater than 20 yards. So if you're trying to work on power production, first step quickness, explosiveness, and you're trying to talk about greater acceleration, you're going to be less than 20 yards. If you're talking about greater overall speed development, you're going to be greater than 20 yards versus less than 20 yards. I might have said greater there. Sorry if I did. So again, acceleration, less than 20 yards, speed development, over 20 yards. Got it right on the end. Okay, so frequency, they talk about how many times per week. Depends on the goals. It depends on what they're trying to do. If they're somebody who runs track, they're going to do speed work to varying degrees every single day. My offensive lineman in football won't. It just depends on what they're trying to accomplish. So 2 to 4 is pretty common. I often start off with running technique drills no matter what, just to reinforce the running movement pattern. But doing bona fide speed work or doing conditioning for speed, I don't do every single time. With recovery, depending upon the maximal effort or the effort that you have your athletes perform at, if it's maximal, you're going to have a different work rest ratio than submaximal. And even on a much bigger picture, recovery from maximal level workouts will be different than recovery from submax workouts. So that's from a 1 to 5 ratio to 1 to 10, depending upon what you're doing in terms of sprint work. And then even on the days off, we're talking about days in between. You might have a hard sprint day and then come back 48 hours later and it's an easier technique day. And then you do a medium sprint day 48 hours after that. So you're not doing hard sprint day, hard sprint day, hard sprint day every day. You have to work on having recovery and active recovery built into the equation. And I talk a little bit about this in terms of recovery, from sessions should last about 24 to 48 hours, depending upon the intensity. I would tell you that you could probably fudge that a little bit, depending if you do hard workout, easy workout, medium hard workouts, and you kind of vary the intensities. But just realize in the context of actually doing sprint work, you have to allow maximal recovery. And it makes sense, right? We're not talking about the aerobic system here. We're talking about the opposite end of the spectrum. And you need that full recovery for the replenishment of ATP to be able to run your next sprint. So you have to be able to allow recovery. So you have to build that into your training programming. Volume, you can kind of quantify out what you're looking to do with your athletes. It can start out with a shorter sprint and go to longer. I tend to look at it in terms of I have a short sprint day, an agility day, and then I have more of a conditioning day that includes sprint work, but it's sprint work that includes a conditioning component. So I tend to mix those up as I go through a week, but I tend to quantify this out in terms of my overall volume. Am I doing 10 sets of 10? That's 100 reps. If I do 10 sets of 100-yard sprints, that's 1,000 yards, right? So if it ends up being, is it 100 yards, 1,000 yards? What is the actual quantified amount that you're doing? I can tell you when I ran track in college, we would do it, like I ran 400, we would do a 2-mile warm-up, and then we would do 100, 200, 400, 800, 400, 200, 100, and that was, if you do the math on that, that's a pretty grueling workout. And then you go do a 2-mile cool down after that. Holy cow. I mean, that's a lot of volume. All right, progression and warm up. I put these both on the last slide here. Both of these two are here on this last slide. It must follow principles of progressive overload. So you have to find ways to increase the intensity or the volume. Take your pick. and you have to find ways to modulate those. As you increase intensity, you may have to manipulate the volume to be able to accommodate. They also talk about high volumes of moderate to high intensity, like downhill sprinting versus barrier hops, arm swing action, which is very low intensity. And they talk about with any program, you need to have like a generalized warm up, more specific warm up. And I talk about all the time, you could do a generalized warm up that's like ABC drills and running technique drills that lend themselves to actually a little bit more of a longer lead into what could be a higher intensity sprint workout itself. So it need not be just, I'm going to go for a mile run, then I'm going to do running technique drills and then do squats. You can actually integrate in running technique as your primary warm-up driver, and then you go into more specific stuff that you want to do for box jumps or for perhaps your actual weight workout itself. So with that, I'm signing off. I got one more presentation to do, and then I'll be done.